Mental health professionals, what shattered everything you ever believed about mental health? I used to work in the most violent wing of the worst psych ward in the state. And one Saturday morning, my coworker decided to bring her 10-year-old daughter Poppy in with her after her babysitter canceled. Poppy was set up with homework and snacks while we started morning rounds. Everything was fine until my coworker, we'll call her Becca, decided to show Poppy the observation wing, the safe area where families could watch patients through reinforced glass. When they walked over to the wing, Poppy immediately pointed to a boy behind the glass named Alan. Alan was 11 and our most violent patient. 2 weeks ago, he'd bitten through a nurse's forearm down to the bone. Last month, he fractured an orderly's skull with a food tray. The kid nearly killed his foster father. But when he saw Poppy through that glass, he went completely still. He pressed both palms against the glass and just stared at her. Poppy walked up and placed her small hands exactly where his were on the other side. "Mom, can I talk to him?" Becca ripped her away so fast Poppy stumbled. She dragged her daughter back to the break room while Alan started slamming his fists so hard the glass shook. 20 minutes later, the morning recreation started. This meant room doors were now opened, and even the most dangerous patients we had were all free to walk around the common areas for the next hour. That's when Becca came running down the hall with tears streaming. "Where's Poppy?" she screamed. My stomach dropped as I realized Poppy was missing. To make things even worse, the keycard in Becca's pocket was gone. In all likelihood, Poppy had taken it, and was currently stumbling around the building with unsupervised access to every killer and psychopath we had. One wrong move, and she could be dead. I remember sprinting toward the children's wing while Becca went to check the medical stations. Every second felt like an hour. I kept picturing what some of our patients did before they got here. The way some of them went after girls Poppy's age. That's when Becca radioed me. I heard her hyperventilating and begging me to come to the activities room. I sprinted over so fast my blood vessels burst, and when I finally got there, my hands started shaking. Alan and Poppy were sitting cross-legged on the floor facing each other. He was folding paper into shapes while she watched, doing origami, which he'd never shown to anyone before. They were talking so quietly I couldn't make out the words. Becca and I locked eyes, going pale. We both knew what Alan could do, how fast he could snap. He'd paralyzed his little sister. One triggered memory, and Poppy would be dead before we reached her. I took one step towards them, and Alan's body went rigid. The paper crumpled in his fist, and his jaw clenched. That familiar pre-violence tension filled his shoulders. I instinctively stepped back, and that's when it happened. Poppy put her hand on his arm. Becca let out a terrified squeal immediately. Her motherly instinct took over, and she took a large step forward. But instead of getting violent upon touch like usual, Alan just looked down at Poppy's hand on his arm. His whole body slowly unwound, and you could feel his anger subside. Still, Becca continued creeping forward until she was close enough to tell Poppy they had to go. Poppy seemed reluctant, but eventually stood up. "Can I come see you tomorrow?" she asked Alan. He actually nodded, just once, then watched them leave with this expression I had never seen on his face. Like someone had shown him proof kindness existed, then immediately taken it away. That night, Alan spoke for the first time since arriving. "Where's Poppy?" The next morning, Becca brought her back. I made the decision to cover for them while Poppy and Alan sat together behind safety glass. They did it again the next day. Over 3 weeks, I watched the impossible happen. Alan started eating without being forced. He took medication without restraints. He apologized to the woman he bit. His psychiatrist said it was unprecedented. Alan was a clinical psychopath in every sense of the word, but Poppy's presence was somehow healing his brain. Sadly, 4 weeks in, the hospital administrator Jeffrey found out what was going on. He stormed in, threatening to fire us both immediately. Lawsuits, liability, screaming that his career would be destroyed if that girl got hurt. He gave Becca an ultimatum: stop bringing Poppy or get blacklisted. But Becca didn't choose either. She used all her savings to hire the best lawyer around, who found precedent for therapeutic intervention. Long story short, they proved that under medical supervision, Poppy's visits should be allowed to continue. However, 2 days before the court-ordered visits were supposed to start, Becca brought Poppy in early to tell Alan the good news. But his room was empty. The night nurse told us he'd been transferred during the overnight shift. Apparently, Jeffrey claimed an incident requiring immediate relocation to maximum security occurred. The paperwork was already sealed. Poppy stood in that empty room staring at the unmade bed. But I was helping him. "We'll find him, sweetie." Becca's hand was shaking as she held Poppy close. I stood there staring at the empty bed while my brain went into overdrive. The transfer paperwork was sealed, but there had to be a trail somewhere. Every transport needs documentation. Every facility change requires signatures. I checked my watch and realized we only had 10 minutes before Jeffrey would notice we were missing from our stations. Becca walked Poppy out while I quickly photographed the room number and the empty medication chart still hanging on the wall. My shift ended at 3, and I spent the rest of the day making calls to every facility within 100 miles. Nobody would tell me anything. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. I kept thinking about Alan in some new place, probably tied down and drugged up again. All that progress we'd seen over 3 weeks just gone. My phone buzzed at 2 in the morning. Becca texted that she felt sick about bringing Poppy to work, but she wasn't giving up. She'd already left 3 voicemails for her lawyer. I texted back that we'd figure something out. The next morning, I got to work early and went straight to Fiona Hart's office. She was Alan's psychiatrist, and she was already at her desk looking mad. She hadn't been told about the transfer either. Her medical orders had been completely ignored. She showed me her notes from the day before where she'd written that Alan was making unprecedented progress. She mentioned that transport companies have to file route logs with the state. That gave us something to work with. I was heading back to my station when my phone rang. It was Diane Brennan, Becca's lawyer. She was filing an emergency motion since Jeffrey had violated the court order that was supposed to start in 2 days. But she needed proof the transfer was done in bad faith. She needed documentation showing there was no real incident. I told her I'd see what I could find. During my lunch break, I found Harmony Sumner, the night nurse who'd been on duty when Alan got transferred. She looked nervous when I asked her about it, but she remembered seeing the transport company name on someone's badge. Secure Move Transportation. She wrote it down on a napkin and whispered that what Jeffrey did wasn't right. Back at my desk, I called Secure Move, pretending to verify billing for a patient transfer. The woman on the phone got suspicious immediately and said they couldn't release any destination information. I was still on the phone when Stuart Bishop from Risk Management appeared at my desk. He stood there with his arms crossed, warning me about patient privacy violations. He said Jeffrey had told him I was asking questions I shouldn't be asking. After Stuart left, I called my union rep, Dan Strickland. Dan had been dealing with hospital politics for 20 years. He told me I had whistleblower protections if I documented everything properly. He'd seen administrators pull this exact move before when they got scared of liability. He gave me the number for the state ombudsman and told me to keep copies of everything. That evening, I stayed late going through old shift logs in the filing room. My hands were shaking when I found what I was looking for. An incident report about Alan dated the night of his transfer, but the timestamp on the computer file showed it was created the morning after. Jeffrey had backdated it to justify the transfer. I took photos of the screen showing the file properties and the report itself. The report claimed Alan had attacked a staff member but didn't name who. It was obviously fake. The next day, Fiona called me into her office. She'd drafted a medical affidavit explaining Alan's unique response to Poppy. She wrote about the neurological changes she'd observed and how disrupting this progress could cause permanent psychological damage. She was putting her whole career on the line by contradicting Jeffrey's decision. She asked me to give a copy to Becca's lawyer. I met Diane at a coffee shop near the courthouse. She read through everything I'd gathered and said it was exactly what she needed. She filed her emergency motion that afternoon. Within hours, she got a call from the judge's clerk. The judge wanted Child Protective Services to evaluate whether Poppy had been endangered by the visits. This could go really bad if CPS decided Becca had put Poppy at risk. Diane said we needed to prepare for the worst-case scenario where Becca could lose custody. My stomach turned thinking about Poppy being taken away when all she'd done was help a scared kid. But Diane had dealt with CPS before, and she knew how to frame this properly. She said we needed to focus on the supervised nature of the visits and the medical benefits that Fiona had documented. The whole thing was turning into a massive fight, and we still didn't even know where Alan was. 2 days later, a woman from Child Protective Services showed up at the hospital carrying a thick folder and a recording device. Her name was Yoon, and she had been doing this job for 15 years. She sat down with Becca in the conference room and started asking about every single safety measure we had taken during Poppy's visits with Alan. Becca showed her the visitor logs and explained how we always kept the safety glass between them. Yoon wrote everything down in her notebook and asked to see the actual observation room where the visits happened. She measured the distance between the chairs and took photos of the reinforced glass thickness. Then she asked if she could meet Poppy herself to understand the situation better. Becca called Poppy out of school early and brought her to Yoon's office downtown. Poppy walked in carrying a small cardboard box that she placed carefully on Yoon's desk. She opened it and pulled out 7 paper animals that Alan had taught her to make during their visits. There was a crane with wings that moved when you pulled its tail, a frog that could actually hop if you pressed its back legs, a butterfly with patterns drawn in pencil on each wing. Poppy explained that Alan had shown her special ways to fold the paper that nobody else knew. She demonstrated the technique for making a swan where you had to fold one corner exactly 17 times to get the neck right. Yoon watched Poppy's hands move with the same careful precision Alan must have used. She asked Poppy to teach her how to make the crane, and Poppy guided her through each step. Later that afternoon, Yoon went back to her office and started reviewing every case file she could find about Alan. She pulled records from 3 different counties and 4 different facilities. The pattern jumped out at her immediately. Every single time Alan was scheduled for a family visit or court hearing, he got transferred within 48 hours. It happened 6 times over 2 years. Someone had been keeping this kid isolated on purpose. She made copies of all the transfer dates and highlighted them with yellow marker. Meanwhile, Stuart Bishop sent an official memo to my work email marked urgent and confidential. It said I was under investigation for violating patient privacy policies and accessing restricted information without authorization. If I continued asking questions about Alan's transfer, I would face immediate suspension without pay. The memo had been copied to Human Resources and the hospital's legal department. I printed it out and added it to my growing file of evidence. That same week, Becca got another credit card bill in the mail, and her hands shook when she opened it. The legal fees had already hit $8,000, and Diane needed another retainer payment by Friday. Becca had maxed out her Visa and MasterCard, and was now using her emergency savings just to pay the minimums. She called her sister to ask for a loan, but her sister was dealing with her own financial problems. Becca started looking at her retirement account, even though the early withdrawal penalty would cost her thousands more. The next morning, Harmony pulled me aside near the medication cart and pointed toward the loading dock area. She explained that the security cameras had a 12-foot blind spot, right where the transport vehicles parked. The camera on the left couldn't see past the concrete pillar, and the one on the right was angled too high. Someone who knew the building layout could have moved Alan through that exact spot without being recorded. She drew me a diagram on the back of a medication schedule showing the camera positions and coverage areas. I went to the county clerk's office that afternoon and filled out a formal public records request for all transport authorization documents from the night Alan was moved. The clerk said it would take 4 to 6 weeks to process and cost 50 cents per page for copies. Jeffrey couldn't legally refuse the request, but he could delay it as long as possible. I paid the initial processing fee and got a receipt with a case number. Diane scheduled a deposition with the night supervisor who had signed off on Alan's transfer paperwork. His name was Carl, and he seemed nervous when the court reporter set up her equipment. Under oath, he admitted that Jeffrey had called him at home that night and told him to approve an emergency transfer. When Diane asked why it was an emergency, Carl mentioned something about an insurance audit coming up. He said Jeffrey was worried about liability coverage for violent patients. Diane asked him to repeat that statement 3 times to make sure the court reporter got every word. After 2 weeks of searching through facility directories and making dozens of phone calls, Yoon finally tracked down Alan's location. He was at Millbrook Juvenile Correctional Facility 3 counties away in the northern part of the state. The facility was maximum security with no educational programs and no therapy services. They only allowed visits from immediate family members with court approval. Alan had been there for 16 days already. That evening, Poppy's teacher called Becca's cell phone during dinner. She said Poppy had been getting into arguments with other kids and refusing to do her homework. Today, she had thrown her lunch tray in the cafeteria and spent the afternoon in the principal's office. The school counselor was recommending therapy, but she didn't know about Alan or the hospital visits. Becca made an appointment for Poppy to see someone the following week, even though she couldn't afford another bill. Fiona called me that same afternoon saying she'd reached out to the medical director at Millbrook about Alan's case. She'd sent over 3 weeks of detailed documentation showing his progress with Poppy, including charts of his medication compliance, and the complete absence of violent incidents during their visits. The director listened to everything and even seemed interested in the data, but told her that facility policy tied his hands completely. Maximum security meant no exceptions for visitor lists, period. 2 days later, I was finishing my morning rounds when Stuart showed up at the nurse's station holding a manila envelope. His face looked uncomfortable as he handed me the paperwork, and I saw something that almost looked like regret in his eyes. Jeffrey was putting me on administrative leave, claiming I'd been neglecting my regular duties while focusing too much on Alan's case. The leave was effective immediately, and security would escort me out within the hour. I packed my locker while the security guard waited, my hands shaking with anger at how calculated this all was. Being on leave meant I couldn't access the hospital computer systems anymore, couldn't look up patient records or transfer documents, but it also meant I was free from their non-disclosure agreements and could file complaints without fear of violating employee policies. I drove straight home and spent the entire day writing a detailed report about everything that had happened. Every secret visit, every improvement Alan showed, every lie Jeffrey told about the emergency transfer. I documented dates, times, witnesses, and attached copies of every piece of evidence I'd collected. The state ombudsman's office accepted my complaint the next morning and assigned an investigator named Rachel, who seemed genuinely interested in the case. Within 3 days, they'd opened an official inquiry and started requesting specific documentation about Alan's transfers and all incident reports from the past 6 months. Government investigators had power that we didn't, including subpoena authority and the ability to demand sealed records. Rachel told me they'd already found discrepancies in the transfer paperwork that warranted deeper investigation. Meanwhile, Becca had started working with Poppy's new therapist on something unexpected. The therapist had brought in a reactive shelter dog as part of their session, a German Shepherd mix that barked and lunged at everyone who came near. But when Poppy sat down on the floor and started talking to the dog in the same quiet voice she'd used with Alan, the animal went completely still. She didn't try to touch him, just sat there folding paper while talking softly about nothing in particular. Within 20 minutes, the dog was lying down next to her, calm for the first time since arriving at the shelter. The therapist recorded the whole thing on her phone, saying she'd never seen anything like it. Poppy had some kind of natural gift for reaching damaged creatures that nobody else could help. This video became powerful evidence that what happened with Alan wasn't a fluke, but a genuine therapeutic ability. Diane called me that evening with good news for once. She'd managed to secure a temporary restraining order preventing any further transfers of Alan without court notice and approval. The judge had been disturbed by the pattern of moving Alan right before scheduled visits or hearings, calling it suspicious at best and potentially illegal at worst. It was a small victory, but at least Alan couldn't be shipped off to another facility in the middle of the night again. Yoon had been working her own angles through CPS channels, and finally got permission to interview Alan at Millbrook as part of her ongoing investigation. She drove the 3 hours north and spent 40 minutes with him in a supervised visitation room. When she came back, she called me immediately with tears in her voice. Alan had whispered one word to her, just tomorrow, and spent the entire visit folding a paper crane with the single sheet of paper she'd brought. He still remembered everything, still had hope that Poppy would come back. The crane was perfect, every fold precise despite his hands shaking the whole time. Yoon said his eyes never left the door, like he was waiting for Poppy to walk through at any moment. The behavioral specialist at Millbrook pulled Alan's compliance data and sent it to Diane as part of the legal discovery process. The numbers were undeniable proof of what we'd been saying all along. During the 3 weeks of Poppy's visits, Alan's medication compliance was at 100%, his meal completion averaged 90%, and he had 0 restraint incidents. After the visits stopped, his numbers crashed within 48 hours. Restraints went up to daily occurrences, meal refusal became constant, and medication had to be forced. The data showed a clear correlation that even Jeffrey couldn't argue with. Numbers don't lie, even when administrators do. Then Diane got something even better from an anonymous source inside the hospital. Someone had leaked a whole folder of internal emails between Jeffrey and Stuart from the weeks before Alan's transfer. In one message, Jeffrey had written, "PR disaster if that girl gets hurt, and my career won't survive another incident with media attention." Another email mentioned, "liability exposure beyond acceptable limits," and "need to eliminate this risk immediately." They'd never been worried about actual safety, just about how it would look if something went wrong. Their fear was always about image and lawsuits, not about what was best for Alan or Poppy. That same anonymous source sent me a package at home containing Stuart's personal meeting notes from his risk management sessions. Reading through them, I started to see a different picture than pure evil. Stuart had calculated probability matrices, consulted insurance actuaries, and genuinely believed there was a 70% chance of a catastrophic incident. His notes showed real fear, not just of lawsuits, but of being personally responsible if Poppy got hurt. He'd written, "Can't live with myself if she dies," in the margin of one page. These weren't monsters making evil choices. They were scared people making bad ones. But the damage to those kids were the same either way. Dan showed up at my apartment 2 days later with a stack of union paperwork and told me he was filing a grievance about my suspension. He'd been collecting similar cases for months, other employees who'd been punished for reporting problems at the hospital. The union lawyer said we had a strong case since I'd documented everything, and followed proper whistleblower channels before going to the state. Dan spent 3 hours taking my statement while I showed him all the photos I'd taken of the backdated reports. His face got darker with each piece of evidence. Meanwhile, Diane called Becca with news that the judge had scheduled an evidentiary hearing for 3 weeks out and wanted specific proposals for how supervised visits could work safely. The judge seemed interested in finding a middle ground that would protect both kids while allowing some kind of contact. Becca immediately called Fiona, who started working on a detailed protocol that night. Fiona stayed up until 4 in the morning creating a framework with specific time limits, no physical contact rules, and mandatory nursing oversight at all times. She framed it as a research opportunity that could help other violent kids who might respond to peer connections. Her proposal included weekly progress reports, video monitoring, and immediate termination if any concerning behaviors appeared. While Fiona worked on the protocol, Alan's new facility decided to test whether any peer connection would help, or if it was specific to Poppy. They brought in a 13-year-old girl from their volunteer program who'd been trained to work with difficult patients. The girl sat outside Alan's room for an hour trying to engage him through the door slot. Alan didn't move from his bed, didn't speak, didn't even look toward the door. The staff tried again the next day with a different teen, a boy this time who was closer to Alan's age. Same result, complete non-response. The facility director called Fiona directly to report that Alan only seemed to respond to Poppy specifically, which made their connection even more unusual from a clinical perspective. That weekend, Becca came over and we sat in my kitchen talking about everything we'd done wrong and right. She admitted she should never have brought Poppy to work that first day, and I admitted I should have reported the visits through proper channels instead of covering for them. We both knew we'd broken rules, but we also knew those rules were failing these kids. Becca's hands shook as she described watching Poppy sleep now, seeing her daughter toss and turn with nightmares about Alan being alone. We agreed that going forward we'd follow every protocol to the letter, while still fighting for what the kids needed. The night before the hearing, I sat at my computer typing an impact statement about what I'd witnessed. My fingers moved steady on the keyboard, as I described how our system treats vulnerable kids like threats, instead of humans who need help. I wrote about Alan's transformation during those 3 weeks, about Poppy's natural gift for connection, about how fear-based policies were destroying any chance these kids had for healing. I printed 5 copies and put them in manila folders for the judge. The evidentiary hearing started at 9 in the morning in a small courtroom downtown. Diane presented our case methodically, showing the behavioral data, the medical reports, and the video footage from the hospital's own cameras, showing Alan's improvement during Poppy's visits. Jeffrey sat at the opposing table with the hospital's lawyers, his jaw tight as Diane laid out the evidence. Stuart sat behind him looking uncomfortable in his suit. The judge asked pointed questions about safety protocols, and Jeffrey started sweating through his shirt. She wanted specific details about the supposed incident that triggered Alan's transfer, and Jeffrey kept deflecting to general safety concerns. When Fiona took the stand, she used precise medical terminology to explain Alan's unprecedented progress. She showed brain scan comparisons, behavioral charts, and medication compliance rates that painted a clear picture no one could dispute. Her professional reputation carried serious weight as she explained how Alan's neural pathways were actually changing in response to Poppy's presence. Jeffrey's lawyer tried to challenge her findings, but Fiona had published papers on childhood psychopathy, and her expertise shut down every objection. She stayed calm and clinical while systematically destroying their arguments about Alan being an unchangeable threat. Then came the moment that shifted everything. Stuart got called to testify about the risk assessment for Alan's transfer. Under oath, With the judge staring directly at him, he admitted there had been no actual incident the night Alan was moved. His voice cracked as he explained he'd been trying to protect the hospital from potential lawsuits. He said he'd calculated the risks and believed he was preventing a tragedy. The courtroom went silent except for the court reporters typing. Jeffrey's face turned red as his own risk manager contradicted the official story. The judge asked Stewart to repeat his statement to make sure she'd heard correctly. Stewart confirmed again that the transfer paperwork contained false information about a violent incident that never happened. Jeffrey tried damage control when he took the stand, citing Alan's past violence, the nurse whose arm he'd bitten, the orderly with the fractured skull. He pulled out incident reports from Alan's previous placements, photos of injuries, testimonies from former staff. The judge cut him off mid-sentence and reminded him that past behavior didn't justify falsifying current documents or violating court orders. She said the issue wasn't whether Alan had been violent before, but whether the hospital had acted in good faith when they transferred him. Jeffrey's lawyers asked for a recess and spent 20 minutes in the hallway having a heated discussion we could hear through the door. When they came back in, Jeffrey's lawyers looked defeated and asked if they could present a modified position. The judge told them to make it quick. Yoon stood up next and walked to the front with a thick folder of case files. She spread out papers showing Alan's history of transfers and isolation periods over the years. Each time he'd been moved, his violence got worse within weeks. She pointed to specific dates where isolation led directly to self-harm incidents. She told the judge that keeping Alan away from the one person who helped him was basically medical neglect. The patterns were too clear to ignore. She recommended supervised contact with strict rules but said both kids needed this connection. Jeffrey's face turned red as Yoon kept talking about how the system had failed Alan for years. The judge took notes while Yoon explained her plan for monthly visits with no touching allowed. There would be a table between them and 2 staff members watching at all times. An oversight committee would review every session and could stop visits if anything seemed unsafe. After 3 hours of testimony, the judge called for a break to review everything. We sat in the hallway while Jeffrey paced back and forth on his phone. Stewart sat alone staring at his hands. When we got called back in, the judge looked tired but determined. She said the evidence showed clear therapeutic benefit that outweighed the risks. She authorized monthly 20-minute sessions starting in 2 weeks. Alan and Poppy could sit at opposite ends of a table with no physical contact. 3 staff members had to be present and cameras would record everything. An oversight committee of 5 professionals would review each visit. It wasn't what we'd hoped for, but at least they'd see each other again. Jeffrey stormed out without saying anything while his lawyers packed up their files. 2 days later, I got a call from Human Resources about my administrative leave. They were lifting it, but with conditions attached. I could return to work immediately, but couldn't have any direct contact with Alan's case. They assigned me to document other patients while different staff would handle the visits. It felt wrong being pushed aside, but at least I still had my job. The woman from HR said the hospital board had been meeting about the whole situation. Word got around fast that Jeffrey had been reassigned to a position with no patient contact. He'd be working in billing and insurance verification from now on. Stewart got put in charge of writing new transfer protocols with mandatory review periods. People whispered in the break room about how Jeffrey's office had been cleared out overnight. His nameplate disappeared from the door, and a temporary administrator took over. It wasn't real justice for what they'd done, but seeing consequences happen felt like progress. Dan called me that afternoon about the union grievance we'd filed. The hospital agreed to a formal non-retaliation agreement protecting any employee who reported violations. They'd have to post notices about whistleblower rights in every department. Dan said this would help other workers speak up without fear of losing their jobs. The agreement covered me specifically, but also set rules for future cases. Any supervisor who retaliated against someone reporting patient care issues would face immediate termination. The union had been fighting for this protection for years. Over the next week, Becca studied every page of the visitation protocol. She made flashcards of the rules and practiced explaining them to Poppy. Her hands shook when she talked about it, but she kept saying both kids deserved this chance. She bought Poppy new clothes without pockets so nothing could be hidden. She taught her about staying in her chair and keeping her hands visible. Poppy listened carefully and asked if Alan would remember their paper animals. The morning of the first visit arrived faster than expected. I wasn't allowed to be there, but Becca texted me updates from the parking lot. She said Poppy had been up since 4 practicing origami. They went through security 3 times because of new procedures. When they finally got to the visiting room, Alan was already there with 2 guards. Becca said he looked thinner, but his eyes lit up when he saw Poppy. They sat at opposite ends of a long table with their hands flat on the surface. The guards watched every movement while Poppy showed Alan a paper crane she'd made. Alan folded one too, his fingers moving carefully while keeping his palms visible. They couldn't pass them to each other, but they held them up to compare. For 20 minutes, they folded paper and barely spoke. Alan's whole body stayed relaxed in a way the staff had never seen. When time ended, Poppy stood up slowly and waved goodbye. Alan nodded once and watched them leave without any aggressive behavior. That night, Becca called me crying, but they were happy tears. Poppy had slept through the whole night without waking up scared. No nightmares about Alan being gone or hurt. She'd been having bad dreams every night since he disappeared, but seeing him safe had fixed something. Becca kept saying both kids were going to be okay now. She could finally believe it. Fiona sent me an email about a paper she was writing on the case. She'd anonymized all the names and locations but documented the therapeutic breakthrough. Medical journals were already interested in publishing it. Other facilities started calling about implementing similar programs for their violent youth. She said Alan and Poppy might help change how the whole system worked. Yoon started coordinating services to help Poppy process everything she'd been through. She found an art therapist who specialized in trauma and resilience in children. The therapist met with Poppy twice that week and called Yoon amazed. She said Poppy had natural empathy skills that most adults never developed. The way Poppy understood Alan's pain without fear was incredibly rare. The new facility started tracking Alan's behavior patterns and noticed something amazing after they tried using the same calm approach Poppy had shown them. The staff called Fiona with weekly updates about how Alan would sit quietly during group sessions when they gave him paper to fold. His restraint incidents dropped from daily occurrences to maybe once or twice a week. The nurses there couldn't believe a kid who'd been in 4-point restraints every other day was now walking to meals without incident. They implemented every technique that had worked with Poppy and watched Alan transform week by week. The oversight committee held their monthly review and spent 2 hours discussing the case. They approved a new protocol where Alan could write short notes to Poppy between visits, and she could send him drawings. The committee members passed around samples of Alan's writing where he'd drawn small paper cranes in the margins. Poppy had started making colorful pictures of animals doing origami that the staff would tape to Alan's wall. Their connection stayed strong even when they couldn't see each other. Meanwhile, the state ombudsman's office contacted me about a position they had open. They'd heard about our case through the investigation and wanted someone who understood how the system failed kids. The job meant leaving the hospital but working to fix these problems at a bigger level. I spent 3 days thinking about it before accepting their offer. The salary was better, and the work felt more important than just managing one ward. Becca met with Diane to work out payment arrangements for all the legal bills that had piled up. The lawyer set up a monthly plan that Becca could actually afford without losing her apartment. The new non-retaliation policy meant her job was safe, and she even got approved for overtime shifts to help with expenses. She looked tired all the time, but kept saying it was worth it to see both kids doing better. Alan's therapist at the new facility sent reports that amazed everyone. During his daily sessions, Alan had started folding paper without anyone suggesting it. He'd make a crane or a frog and then look at the therapist and ask about tomorrow. The kid who never talked about the future was learning to expect good things might happen. His whole treatment team celebrated when he made his first unprompted positive statement about wanting to learn more shapes. 3 months passed with Alan following every rule at the facility. His good behavior reports stacked up, and the review board approved his transfer to a step-down unit closer to where Becca lived. The new place allowed bi-weekly visits for patients who showed consistent improvement. Alan packed his few belongings, including a shoebox full of Poppy's drawings. The transfer happened on a Tuesday morning without any incidents. Poppy's teacher called Becca one afternoon about something wonderful happening at the school. Poppy had started a club where kids made origami animals to send to patients at different hospitals. She taught the other students how to fold paper while telling them that small kind gestures could help people who were struggling. 23 kids signed up the first week. The principal loved the idea so much she gave them a classroom to meet in during lunch. Poppy made a poster that said, "Kindness starts with one small fold." My last day at the hospital came faster than expected. The staff threw a small party in the break room with grocery store cake and warm soda. People signed a card wishing me luck at my new job. Stuart showed up near the end when most people had left. He pulled me aside and thanked me for standing up to the administration. He told me he'd started seeing a therapist to deal with his anxiety about work. He said watching everything that happened made him realize his fear was hurting people. He shook my hand and walked away before I could respond. Diane called me that week with news about her practice. She'd taken on 3 more families dealing with similar institutional problems. Our case had set legal precedent that other lawyers were already using in their arguments. She said one family had been fighting for 2 years to get their son proper treatment, and our case gave them the ammunition they needed. She was doing all these cases for free because she believed in the work now. Yoon reached out with something unexpected about Alan's family situation. His biological sister, who he'd hurt years ago, had been following his progress through the case reports. She was 17 now and wanted to try reconnecting with her brother. She'd written Yoon a long letter about forgiveness and wanting to understand what happened to Alan. Yoon was working with both facilities to see if supervised contact might be possible. The sister lived 2 hours away but said she'd make the drive if Alan was willing to see her. Yoon thought this could be huge for Alan's recovery if handled carefully. She'd already talked to Alan's therapist about how to approach the topic without triggering his guilt. The possibility of family healing seemed real for the first time since Alan entered the system. Everything kept moving forward with each small victory building on the last. The hospital board voted to require trauma training for every single staff member after what happened with Alan. Fiona got picked to run the sessions since she'd seen firsthand how connection worked better than restraints. She used slides showing Alan's behavior charts before and after meeting Poppy, while nurses took notes and asked questions about de-escalation techniques. The training rolled out over 3 months with mandatory attendance, and Stuart had to sit through every session looking uncomfortable whenever Fiona mentioned how fear-based decisions hurt patients. 6 months passed, and Alan's new facility sent progress reports that made everyone who'd known him before do a double take. He was talking in full sentences during Poppy's visits, and had started taking regular classes with other kids his age. His teacher wrote in the report that Alan tested way above grade level in math and science when he felt safe enough to participate. The kid who used to bite through people's arms was now raising his hand to answer questions and working on group projects without any violent incidents. Poppy and Alan spent one whole visit making paper animals together for the facility's Family Day event. They folded cranes and frogs and butterflies and dragons until they had enough for a whole zoo display that other families stopped to admire. Some younger kids asked Alan how he made the complicated dragon, and he actually showed them step by step without getting frustrated or angry. The staff couldn't believe they were watching the same boy who'd been in full restraints just months earlier. Becca called me one afternoon while I was packing boxes at my new apartment to tell me about Poppy's latest career announcement. The kid had decided she wanted to be a therapist after seeing how much the visits helped Alan, and nothing would change her mind. She'd already checked out library books about psychology and was teaching her classmates breathing exercises during recess when they got upset. That little girl understood something about healing that most adults never figure out, and she was only 10 years old. My new position with the state ombudsman's office meant driving all over to different facilities, investigating complaints about kids in the system. In my first year alone, I got 5 children out of bad situations using the legal precedent from Alan's case. Each time I filed the paperwork, I thought about how Alan and Poppy taught us that connection matters more than control, and every kid deserves someone who sees them as more than their worst moment. Alan's treatment team approved him for supervised trips into the community after 8 months of good behavior. His first request wasn't for fast food or video games, but to visit the public library downtown. He checked out 3 books about advanced origami techniques and spent the whole outing quietly reading in the reference section while his supervisor watched in amazement. When they got back to the facility, Alan started teaching origami classes to other residents during recreation time, and the violent incidents in his unit dropped by half. A full year after that empty room where Poppy stared at Alan's unmade bed, everything had changed in ways nobody could have predicted. Alan had moved to a therapeutic foster home with people trained in trauma care and was seeing Poppy every week in family therapy sessions. The foster parents sent updates about Alan helping with dinner and playing with their dog and doing homework at the kitchen table like any other kid. Poppy would visit on Saturdays, and they'd sit in the backyard folding paper or working on the school projects while Becca watched from the porch with tears in her eyes. Sometimes when I drive past the old hospital on my way to investigate a new case, I see paper cranes hanging in the windows of the violent ward. The nurses started making them during quiet moments and teaching patients who wanted to learn because they remembered what happened when one small girl saw a dangerous boy as someone worth helping. Each crane represents someone who learned that fear makes us do terrible things, but connection can heal wounds we thought would never close. And that's my side of it. I'm always curious to hear yours, though. Scroll down and leave a comment so we can keep the conversation going.